All right. So what else? How many of you guys are familiar with Stan's work? You know, have met him, studied with him, read his books, done a workshop with him? Maybe just give a wave. Oh, that's a lot of you. Okay. So this will sort of be a review, hopefully some new stuff though at the same time. Anyone want to yell out sort of how you met him or what your experience with Stan was?
I studied with him. This is Kimberly. I studied with him for a bit because I had practiced breath work with different people, and I just like to get into the meat of the matter. So I went and met with him, and it was pretty interesting. I mean, I love his work. I've read lots of his books. I think he's phenomenal. I love to watch him process a room of 700 people.
Yeah, that is quite a scene to see him kind of moving across the floor and dropping down and working with somebody.
At 80 some years old.
Yeah.
So I want that energy.
So I'm going to start by just giving you a little bit of Stan's background. And then we'll also be talking about today what kind of things happen in the non-ordinary state. So there's a picture of Stan. He's probably about 10 or 15 years old, that photo. So he was a psychiatrist in Prague in the mid-50s. And in the 40s is when Albert Hofmann at Sandoz discovered LSD. And Sandoz knew they had an interesting compound. They weren't quite sure how to market it. So they called it a psychotomimetic, right? So this will imitate a psychosis. And they sent it out to a bunch of psychiatrists, including Stan. And they said, you can, if you're studying people who have psychotic disorders, you can use this to replicate it. You can also use it to have a subjective experience of what it's like to be in a psychotic episode. So Stan took it, and his experience was completely not psychotic. It was very organized. It was profound. It made sense to him. It was deeply spiritual. He connected with, various spiritual archetypes that he didn't really know much about, but he kind of knew of, and was moving. So obviously he got very interested in LSD. He started using it himself, and he also started using it with his patients. So over the years, he's done probably about 4,000 LSD psychotherapy sessions. In the 60s, he moved from Prague, where he was practicing, to the United States. And he worked at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Institute at Johns Hopkins and continued the LSD research. One of the main groups that he worked with, and he wrote a lot about this in his book LSD Psychotherapy, were people with end-stage cancer. And many of them, from their LSD experiences, just lost their fear of death, right? Because in that experience, you have kind of a death and a rebirth, and sort of reprogram them not to fear death. And as a result, they were able to reduce their anxiety medication and reduce their pain medication. They also, in facing their death, kind of took control over it and would invite their loved ones in to complete their relationship, say whatever they had to say. So it was generally very positive for most people who were taking the LSD in these studies. They also work with other populations. But as some of you know, in the 60s, also Timothy Leary and friends at Harvard were popularizing LSD, right? So they were recommending that people use it indiscriminately. And the thing about these powerful substances, or really any work in non-ordinary states is that set and setting are key. And by set we mean mindset. Like, what's your intention? What are you bringing in to the experience? And setting is what's your environment? Where are you doing it? So, are you, are you in a comfortable home, lying down with eye shades, hearing classical music, with someone there to hold space for you, or are you at a loud, crazy concert with a bunch of drunken stoned people and you don't even know why you took this thing except that your friend gave it to you? So with that kind of set and setting, it's much more likely to have a difficult or traumatic experience even. And of course, some people just were having bad results. The government took notice, made LSD illegal, funding dried up, and so Stan left that work and moved to Esalen, which is like a new agey think tank on the West Coast. And he became what they call scholar in residence there. And he taught there. He got to meet a lot of people coming through. He met his wife, Christina, there, and together they put together the format of holotropic breathwork. So Stan says that he noticed that some of the LSD people, at the end of their sessions, some of them would spontaneously start to breathe faster and deeper. And it seemed that intuitively they knew that this would help them bring up whatever material was remaining to be processed and get through to the other side of it. So that made him curious, well, what if we just had people breathe that way? And the LSD work already included a music component, so that got added. Really, Christina was very involved with that. And then they also added a bodywork component to help people sort of move through where energy is blocked and stuck. So out of that came holotropic breathwork that we still practice today. And obviously this is how I know Stan and met him. So there's Stan with Albert Hoffman. So I'm talking about holotropic breathwork. Anyone want to shout out what holotropic means? 3, 2, 1. Okay,
towards wholeness.
Towards wholeness, right. So holotropic means moving towards wholeness. And when Stan makes up words, he doesn't skimp. So at the same time, he made up this word, hylotropic, which means moving towards matter. Hylos meaning Greek for matter. So he is sort of describing two ways of being in the world, two kinds of consciousness. Alan Watts does this too. He calls them spotlight and floodlight consciousness. But basically, hylotropic or spotlight consciousness is focused. It is sort of it's materialistic. It's limited into the here and now. It's sort of how we get things done. It's conducive for a society who wants to have a good economy. It's how we kind of keep things rolling. A holotropic state is expanded beyond that. So it's more of the floodlight where we can experience a lot more stuff that you might not think is possible in a hylotropic state. So you can transcend certain boundaries of time, of space, of your body, and of your ego, and have access all kinds of other information and experience. All right, so how does a human being do that? And this is where I'm going to ask you all to shout out, like, what are different things that can happen to a human being or a human being can participate in that provide access to these states?
Meditation.
Meditation, yes.
Experiencing trauma.
Yeah, well, trauma is interesting, but yeah, I think in some ways trauma can shift your consciousness into this state, often not in a helpful way, but perhaps sometimes it could be. But yeah, what else?
Plant medicine.
Plant medicine, yes. So there are plants that grow all over the world in different continents, and they will reliably give humans access to these states. Not only that, even some animals, right? Like bufotoxin, a toad that secretes a chemical that allows people to journey. What else?
Flow.
Hello.
Flow.
Flow. Yeah, I think flow is a state. Yeah, and so activities that help us get there will help us shift our consciousness. What else?
Fasting.
Fasting. Yep. There's more.
Drumming.
Drumming. Yes.
Music.
Yeah. So you can put people in a lab and play certain drum frequencies and rhythms and reliably change their brain waves. Anything else?
Dancing.
Yeah.
Dancing. Yes. So yeah. Well, let's look at some pictures, right? So here we have drumming, rattling. On the right, dancing, right? These are the whirling dervishes. That's a Sufi practice, and they're spinning. That creates a non-ordinary state. Here we
Sorry.
have praying. Yep. Here we have fasting. On the left, chanting, right? Buddhist chanting. Sleep deprivation is one we didn't mention. Sleep, if you really consciously deprive yourself of sleep, you can drop into a non-ordinary state. Temperature extremes we didn't mention, right? So here's a sweat lodge, but also extreme cold. I think the people who do that, the polar bear swimming, I think they kind of get off on it in a certain way. It shifts consciousness. Here's one we didn't say, sensory deprivation, right? Bottom left, you see a flotation tank. And, that's a more modern way, a more traditional way to have sensory deprivation would be a vision quest. Right? Because on a vision quest, you just go and you be in one spot and you leave your device at home and your magazines and it gets kind of boring, and then you just let go into that and your consciousness expands. I don't know if you can see these, some of them maybe are small, but the bottom in the middle, that's a scene from the Da Vinci Code. And if you remember that guy, he would flagellate himself, and he also wore this like garter belt of thorns kind of. And I don't think, this practice was sort of about guilt or punishment. It's really about transcending pain into an ecstatic state. And then on the bottom right, you have a depiction of the sun dance, right? And this is a practice that the Lakota Sioux still do, and I guess some other tribes too. And they would combine a bunch of these techniques. So they would fast and have a sweat lodge and perhaps sleep deprivation. At the end of the whole experience, the men would pierce their pectoral muscles with bone, and that would get tied to this pole, and they'd dance around the pole, and at the end they would pull away and it would rip their flesh, and that pain would send them into that ecstatic state.
They still do that.
Yeah. I like that one because, sometimes when we offer holotropic breathwork, people complain about having to get up early. So it's like, okay, just be glad we're not doing that. Count your blessings. So people have accessed these states for at least 40,000 years. Here we see some cave drawings. There's some burial sites that show evidence of shamanic activity. Some think that they would journey and connect to the consciousness of these animals.
Hey Ted, can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
Could people make sure to mute yourself if you're not talking? Because we're hearing some funny noises. I know who you are. I chatted you privately.
Okay. So please put your mute on. As I said before, if you want to talk, just hold down your space bar if you're on a computer and you can talk that way. Otherwise, just unmute to say what you want to say. So, the idea is that they would access the consciousness of these animals and know where they were so they could go and hunt them. So in the 70s, some anthropologists did a cross-cultural study and around the world and back through time, and found that 90% of cultures have institutionalized a way to access these states. So I don't know if you can read all these words, but there's the 90% that honors non-ordinary states and 10% that pathologizes them. And this is us, like we're in that 10%. And you might say, well, how could you say that? Because some states have now declared that liquor stores are essential services in the lockdown. But that particular non-ordinary state, maybe it's not so useful. It's a non-ordinary state. It's not really a holotropic state. It's not the kind of consciousness that we're talking about here. So people access non-ordinary states in different contexts, right? So a bunch of different healing rituals or other rituals, rites of passage, will all invoke these states. A lot of the current mainstream religions originated in a mystical practice where people would access these states. Here's an interesting example. So a couple thousand years ago in Greece, and this went on for 2,000 years, they would practice these mysteries, and anyone that you've studied about, all the philosophers and mathematicians and poets were participating. And we call it, people who are interested in this call it the Eleusinian mysteries, because it took place near Eleusis, I guess is the town. And there's some pretty good guessing that these people were drinking a brew made from rye, and ergot would grow on the rye, and ergot is very similar to LSD. So for 2,000 years, all these ancient Greeks were tripping, and it was just a very important and integral part of their culture. All right, so what happens in the non-ordinary state? Now, you could describe it all different ways, but Stan sort of has his own way of talking about it. And he divides the experiences into these 4 categories that he calls sensory and somatic, biographical and individual unconscious, the perinatal, and the transpersonal. You want to jump in with a question at this point, or should I forge ahead? All right, so we're going to get into what each one of these is. So first, the sensory and somatic. So this could be, just various ways that senses get activated or triggered. You might see geometrical patterns or hallucinations, or other senses could have hallucinatory experience too. I put the moose there because in one of my breathworks, that's what I saw. It kind of looked like this moose. This sort of appeared to me like in 3 dimensions. It was weird. But also in the sensory and somatic realm, we include all the stuff that happens in the body. And you might experience energy, how it's streaming, flowing, but also how it's blocked. You may feel compelled or sort of intuitively that you want to go into certain postures. They might actually be yoga postures, but they could be any kind of position. And it's like your body's telling you what it needs and you do it. Mudras, right? Hand postures, movements. On the bottom there, you see someone's hand in tetany. So tetany happens in breath work about 30% of the time, and it's sort of showing you where energy is blocked and congealed. And sometimes people can just tune into that, connect it to something in life that they're just holding on to and trying to control. And as they just decide to let that go, the tetany resolves at the same time. So the second realm of experience, the biographical and individual unconscious. So this is the stuff you talk to your therapist about, right? It's like all the stuff that happened to you since you were born. And it would include unintegrated traumas, unresolved conflicts, repressed memories. If you can't see those boxes, that one box says childhood memories and one says repressed memories. Okay. Guess he's in his basement digging it all up. And we realize that there's traumas of commission. That's normally what we think of when we think of trauma, things that were done to you or happened to you. But there's also traumas of omission. So things that you needed and didn't get are traumatic as well. And traumas of commission, sometimes just by going through the memory and letting yourself feel it, and especially if you're also aware of how safe you are in the moment, can significantly reduce the impact of that trauma. And at the end, if you guys want to ask about Bruce Ecker's work with memory deconsolidation, breath work and all non-ordinary state work really provides a way to optimize how memories can get deconsolidated by this contrasting experience, right? So you just relive and feel the bad stuff, but you also know that everything's fine in the moment. Interesting thing is, in the non-ordinary state, not just psychological trauma comes up like it would in maybe talk therapy, but physical traumas, accidents, surgeries, near drownings. These memories tend to come up. It's like there's a charge on them that needs to be released, and so the psyche just lets it happen. All right, here's the third realm. And you want to shout out, what does perinatal even mean?
Before birth.
Okay.
Is that
Well,
right?
almost. So like the word perimeter, right? It means around. So perinatal means around the birth process. So basically, before your birth, during your birth, right after your birth. That's the whole perinatal realm. And this is huge. Stan wrote a book called The Psychology of the Future. And of course, a lot of his books cover a lot of the same material. And he really is making the case that our current psychology is really limited. By limiting it to the biographical realm, we're missing out on these huge contributors to our experience, the perinatal and also the transpersonal, which we'll get to in a minute. So, it used to be thought, at least in the West, that when a baby is born, it's not really an experience. Like the neurons aren't myelinized enough to transmit and store information, and it's a non-event. Like the baby doesn't really feel it or remember it, and it's pretty clear that that's not true, right? That because people can remember in a non-ordinary state, they can pull up these memories. They might have a memory of something that happened during their birth or an intervention, and go look at their hospital records and find out that they're right. There's all kinds of, you like to play music to the baby in the womb and this kind of stuff. So it seems pretty clear that we're already having an experience even before our birth. So if that's the case, imagine the trauma, right? So like we talk about the trauma in our life in therapy, but what about the trauma of birth? And it's huge. I mean, the physical trauma of like these huge amounts of pressure that are squeezing the baby, and the chemistry is becoming toxic, and oxygen supply is cut off by the contractions, and and then there's all the interventions, all the stuff that the doctors and nurses do to you if you're not lucky. So a lot of physical trauma during birth, but also emotional, because no one sends you a text and says, all right, you're going to be born in 5 minutes and you're going to have a whole life ahead of you and it's going to be so awesome. And like our experience during birth this is it. Like whatever this place was that was taking care of us, we are being kicked out and we're done for. So that's traumatic. And another thing about the perinatal realm is, anyone know who this is? Psychology majors, shout it out. I stumped you. All right, well, that's Conrad Lorenz, and he studied imprinting. I see some heads nodding. So he said that like these, geese or ducklings, when they were born, are really primed for learning deeply. And if he's the first thing that they saw, then they would imprint to him as their mother, and they would just follow him around like he was their mother. And you'd think that some of these ducks would wise up and go, "Hey, look over there. There's a thing. It looks just like me, but bigger. Maybe that's my mommy." But no, they just persist in thinking he's their mommy. And in the same way, any learning that gets imprinted to us is very hard to dislodge, right? It's just so deep. We just believe it like it's just the truth. So imagine the kind of things that we could imprint, like I'm not wanted, or I'm the wrong sex, or life is painful, don't trust people in white coats, it hurts to breathe, I'm wrong. And these primal beliefs can just be in the psyche, and you could go to therapy forever and not even touch them. So the opportunity to rewind all the way back to birth and kind of dislodge and excavate these experiences can be really powerful at releasing these negative beliefs. All right, fourth category, the transpersonal. So this includes, it's sort of like holotropic, right? It's experiences that transcend, that go beyond the personal. So it could be past life memories, could be becoming another being, like sort of identifying with what it's like to be a tiger, say, or a bird. And when this happens, right, so people report, it's not like I thought about a bird, it's like I was the bird. And like flying was nice, but even more interesting was the vision, like what it's like for this bird to see, just really blew my mind. So you can kind of get insight into what it's like to be an animal, or maybe even a whole collective, like a race of people, a group of people who were persecuted. Could be what it's like to be a field of wheat blowing in the wind. In the transpersonal realm, you also have connection to what Jung called the collective unconscious, and encountering these various archetypes or these archetypal beings. You might get to meet some angels. That picture on the bottom left, this happens, pretty commonly in breathwork, where people will get visited by someone who's moved on, often a parent. They'll get to talk to this person and kind of feel their presence. So that would be a transpersonal experience, getting to meet these divine beings. Dissolving in the white light, unit of consciousness, cosmic void. These are all transpersonal experiences. All right, so let's pause here for questions, and then we're gonna sort of unpack the perinatal realm. So before we do that, any comments or questions?
Hey, Ted, this is Deanna.
Hey,
I'm
Deanna.
interested in hearing more about what you were saying. And you said maybe we could ask questions about it later, and I don't know if now's the time. I think you said decompressed memories or something like that?
Yeah, so memory deconsolidation, which is,
Deconsolidation, yeah.
it's a really interesting piece of work, I think. It's sort of peripheral to this talk. So whoever wants to hang out at the end and if you want to ask that later, sort of when we're finishing up, then yeah, happy to share something about it and provide some resources.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, any other questions or comments? All right, here we go then. So here we're going to look at the 4 basic perinatal matrices. And here's one way to describe them, but each one of these represents a stage of the birth process. So when we talk about it, we'll talk about BPM1, or we'll talk about the first matrix. It means the same thing. So BPM1, the amniotic universe, this is just the floating in the womb, sort of that whole gestation. BPM2, cosmic engulfment and no exit. That's physiologically when the contractions are happening, but the cervix hasn't dilated yet. So you're under attack and you're trapped in there. You can't get out. BPM 3, the death-rebirth struggle. So that's the movement through the birth canal, which can have sort of huge and aggressive energies. BPM 4, the death-rebirth experience. That's sort of when you come out and you made it. And it's sort of the tension of the third matrix releases, and it's sort of like ta-da, and hopefully you get to reconnect with mommy again. So now we're going to explore each of these. Oh, first, so another term that Stan made up, COEX system, standing for a system of condensed experience. So this refers to a bunch of memories or transpersonal experiences that are connected by a feeling, but they might not have a logical connection, but there's something about how they feel that ties them together. And when people are processing in a non-ordinary state, sometimes they'll kind of move from one of these to the next, and we call that a coex. And we're going to talk about the coex of each of the birth stages as they extend into the biographical realm and the transpersonal realm. And if that doesn't make sense, it will when we do it. So here we go with the first matrix. As I said before, it's just the floating in the womb. And, you know, there can be some trauma in there, some pretty serious disturbances. The bottom right picture is showing that if the mother was taking certain drugs, if there was a famine, if there's a war, she's experiencing abuse. A real severe example would be an attempted abortion, you know, so that the fetus is really having a trauma in there. But those are exceptions, and the rule is it's pretty nice. It's pretty chill in there. Like everything's kind of perfect. You know, the temperature's just right, and sounds are pleasantly muffled, and everything's cushioned, and all your needs are met. Like you just get fed, and your waist drain, and you don't have to work for it. It's nice. And there's another thing too. Can anyone shout out who this is? Or who are these people?
Groucho Marx, and I forget the woman's name.
Yes, so it's Groucho Marx, and that's Margaret Dumont. And you know, in a bunch of those Marx Brothers movies, she would be rich, and he would be trying to marry her for her money. But I remember one where they're dancing, and she goes, "Hold me closer," and he goes, "If I held you any closer, I'd be on the other side of you." But it's like it's sort of representing this thirst for connection, like closer, 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 this longing for like emerging even. And this is what we have in the first matrix, right? You can't get any closer to someone than being inside of them. So there's that kind of wonderful experience of connection in the first matrix. So how does this feeling extend into our lives? So in the biographical coex, I think one example is going on vacation to a place like this, right? Because, you know, let's say the weather sucks or your job is really stressful, and you get on a plane and you end up on this beach, and the temperature's perfect, just like the womb, and the water is there, just like the womb, and you don't have to work, just like the womb, and someone just kind of brings you a drink, kind of like the womb, and just sort of like perfection. So I think for some people, their desire for vacations like this is sort of unconsciously a desire just to go back to that first matrix and recreate that blissful state. I think another example of how the first matrix influences our lives is when we fall in love. Because when we fall in love, we sort of look at this person and we go, wow, you're going to meet all my needs, aren't you? And you're going to just be connected to me. And I'm just going to be taken care of wonderfully. And it's so appealing and attractive. And so you start up the relationship. And of course, 6 months later, you kind of wake up and you go, wow, they actually expect me to do that for them. And then the real relationship starts, right? The power struggle, and the infatuation's over. But I think the infatuation stage is, again, this kind of unconscious memory of the first matrix and just a desire to go back there. In the transpersonal realm, first matrix would manifest as heaven, right? Because, is there really a place called heaven? Who knows? I don't think so. Many cultures talk about heavens or heavenly places. Many of these cultures have never had contact with each other. There's a lot of similar themes in these heavens, but they're all kind of coming from this first matrix, right? This sort of floating, no work, everything's perfect, all your needs are met, and you're connected. You're connected to God, or what you might hear when you're 6 is like, yeah, when we die, we're going to go to heaven, and Pop-Pop's there and Fluffy, and so we'll get to reconnect with them. So here's some cross-cultural depictions of heaven. I don't know if you can see the detail, but there's a Christian version, a Muslim version, a Buddhist version, a lot of similarities. The Native American, happy hunting grounds. Upper right, you see an alchemical version, right? So in alchemy, like heaven is infinite abundance, and here they're handing out gold, as much as you want. Down there, it's, I guess, a more Christian depiction of heaven. First matrix could feel like this oneness with the universe, sort of floating through the cosmos. You see the fetus still is connected to Earth through the umbilical cord. It was connected to something. So that's the first matrix. So here we go, BPM 2. Physiologically, the fetus is now experiencing contractions, but there's no way out. So the cervix hasn't dilated yet. And the chemistry changes there, as I said. The oxygen supply is being clamped down upon. The feelings are like, I'm a victim, I'm powerless, I'm helpless, this is hopeless. Often it includes a feeling of guilt, because why else would this be happening? Because I must have done something, I deserve this. So it's not fun, right? So that's sort of the experience of being in the second matrix. This, by the way, some of these paintings and drawings are done by Stan himself. So this one is he used to be a cartoonist, actually, before he decided to be a psychiatrist. So he drew this one, kind of depicting the second matrix experience, clamped down upon like that. This one has a little bit of a feel of third matrix too, right? This kind of movement, but you see it sort of feels like there could be death right around the corner, and we're helpless to really do anything. We're just at the mercy of these overwhelming destructive forces. Anyone identify this artist? I know some of you know who this is. Unmute and say it. No? All right, well, this is Hans-Ruedi Giger. He kind of got known, in the popular culture through creating the alien in the first Alien movie, or I guess a bunch of them. So he designed that creature, and he has done a bunch of paintings and drawings and work that amazingly depicts these second and third matrix themes, right? So here you see the toxicity of the womb, and this sense of being jammed in there and stuck in this kind of mechanical nature, right? Of you just being a victim of these contractions. Here's a mandala someone did about the second matrix. If you can't read it, it says guilt on the bottom, but then before that it says, I am responsible, I am no good. So here's a sense that goes with the second matrix that, I must deserve this somehow. And here's another depiction of sort of the dangers in there, in the womb, in that water. So in the biographical realm, when we're under the influence of the second matrix, I think this is what depression is, right? So when we're depressed, we're very much in alignment with what it feels like to be in that second matrix. And things are dark and they seem hopeless. This person wrote here, it feels like everyone else is moving on with their lives while I am stuck here in this hole that I can't climb out of. So sometimes I think in depression, people are just reconnecting to that feeling, but they believe it. And maybe you've talked to people who are depressed, or you've been in this place where you just are thinking like, I am just stuck in this horrible job or relationship and there's no way out and there's nothing I can do about it and I'm helpless and it's hopeless and I'm a victim here. And I guess sometimes there's truth to that, but many times it's just a feeling. And the problem with depression is we have those feelings and then we believe them. And then when we believe that negative stuff, it makes us more depressed. And it stops us from taking actions that could help us get out of the depression. So doing this work in the second matrix can be very powerful for depression. It can teach us how to just be with the feeling and just go, it's second matrix. Not like, oh no, I'm getting depressed. Here we go. I'm going to be stuck here for a year. But just like, okay, it's all right. It's second matrix. I know this feeling. I'm just going to breathe. I'm going to be here. And the more you can do that, the more likely it is you'll just kind of move out of it before you know it. So the biographical coex, also feelings of claustrophobia. Upper right, you see an Iron Maiden. That was a torture device. Bottom left, maybe you recognize that scene from Star Wars, where they're in the trash compactor and the walls start moving in on them and they're trying to desperately save themselves. And a lot of movies will, and I don't know if the directors and writers consciously are doing this. I think some are and some aren't, but when they include these perinatal themes, it's very evocative and moving and effective in a movie to kind of draw on this perinatal material. In the transpersonal second matrix, the first matrix is heaven. So second matrix, well, at the beginning, I think these two are describing that the very beginning of second matrix, where right in the first picture, it's like they're in heaven and then they fall from grace, right? So they're sort of falling through and end up going to hell. The second picture is a depiction of the eviction from the Garden of Eden, right? So it's the same kind of myth. It's right, like Garden of Eden's like the first matrix, but they did something wrong and now the shit hits the fan and they are getting kicked out. So second matrix has that same feel, but second matrix really is about being in the hell realms. And again, just like heaven is like first, hell like the second, in that we are being victimized, we're guilty, we can't get out, there's nothing we can do about this, it's painful. And another aspect of the second matrix is that it feels eternal, right? And that's what the preachers say about hell, right? Like when you go to hell, it's forever. And when we're depressed, it feels like that, doesn't it? So part of kind of visiting the second matrix is just to kind of hang out in a place where it feels like this is going to be this way forever, even if you know in the back of your mind that it's not. Here's some other depictions of hell. Again, many cultures sort of have this idea. And then we can tap into the collective, right? So tapping into collective of prisoners of war would be how we'd extend that second matrix into the transpersonal realm. Sort of being trapped by a spider in the web, being lost in a maze. So these all have those second matrix kind of energies. So now moving on to BPM 3, physiologically, in some ways it's similar to the second matrix, right? Because you're still under attack. It's still painful. It's still dangerous. You still feel like you might die, but you're no longer trapped and you're no longer stuck. And so the theme here is more about the aggression and the struggle and the getting through the birth canal. So here's some more of Giger's work. So you see this sort of, in the third matrix, you have death, you have birth, you have sacred symbols, you have profane symbols, you have sexuality. Here's another one. You just love that third matrix, Eager. And here you see, right, like the forces, and sort of the ejecting the fetus from the womb, right? Like in the right, it's going to be shot out. And it's fraught, it's dangerous. In the biographical realm, I think people who are under this influence, right? So instead of being depressed, like the second, they're going to just feel like everything's a battle and a struggle. And they will be drawn to activities that match that, right? Because like if you're feeling this energy, like that you're seeing in, in these protests, say, and you're lying on a beach, you're kind of going to feel crazy. It's not going to be comfortable. But if you're feeling this energy and you're in one of these scenes, it kind of matches up and it's going to make more sense to you. And so you're going to be drawn to those scenes. So these people who are under this influence will be attracted to these kinds of protests and revolutions. And, on the bottom left, even some people play it out through the legal system, right? They become litigious and they want to fight somebody. I'm going to sue you. Okay, can anyone identify this picture? I'm sure some of you have seen it. It was like very much in the new state capital in Michigan. Yeah. Right. So these guys were told to stay in and they didn't like that. And they came and protested with their guns at the state capitol. They didn't like that the governor had passed a lockdown order. So it's almost like, right, they're saying like, ready or not, I'm coming out now and I'm going to use violence if I have to. It's like being born. It's like, I have to be born. I can't stay in anymore. I got to get out. Right? So the third matrix has that feeling like, I got to get out of here. So I guarantee you that a bunch of these people had something going on in their birth process where they sort of got stuck into that feeling and their whole life revolves around that. You might also be attracted to extreme sports, right? Because again, like if you look at the guy in front of the bull, if he's feeling like that already and then he just goes to lie on the beach, he just won't be able to do it. It's too much of a mismatch, but put him in front of a bull and he feels at home, or like riding a motorcycle in midair, about to die from falling off a mountain. So it just creates a resonance and it feels harmonious to people. So there's an interesting thing where moving through the birth canal, there can be like a sexual arousal in the fetus and perhaps the mother, and it becomes conditioned to some of the other things that are happening, right? Like the danger, the pain, giving or receiving, the scatological material. So, here's some depictions. This movie, Crash, there's a really good movie called Crash, but this is a different one. And these people they get turned on by car crashes. So they go and they'd have sex in the car, like after it was in a crash. And then here's a guy who enjoys, maybe she enjoys sort of giving pain, dominating. Masochism is sort of the other end of that. Here's the scatological material, right? So if we're having a sexual experience at the same time as these other things, we can be conditioned to them and then they become part of our sexual repertoire. Just these giant energies are third matrix. Here's a nuclear bomb or an atom bomb, I guess. It's just evocative of these third matrix energies. If you have a past life experience in the third matrix, very possibly it will involve being in a battle. You might connect with archetypal battles, these giant wars. Like here's the gods on Olympus versus the Titans, and here's a berserker, and battles between the giant forces of light and the forces of darkness, is very third matrix. Here's Saint Anthony and the Cross versus Satan. And So I put here John Perry's psychological renewal through return to the center. And if you have studied spiritual emergency, some people will categorize them. And this is one of kind of 10 categories of spiritual emergency. And basically, it just means that you find yourself at the center of this kind of a experience. And it feels like you're in it and you play a significant role. And it's like a global battle or a battle of cosmic significance. And if you have questions about spiritual emergency, we can do some of that later too if you want. BPM 3, transpersonally tapping into these confluences of sacred and profane, or on the right, death and sex. Witches are kind of third matrix energy. Give you another minute with that one. Here's a Buddhist depiction of third matrix themes. Human sacrifice, right, is very, if you're in this coex, these are the kinds of places you may journey. Here we have, right, so in that place, you could live or you could die, right? You could either be born and live, but you could actually die during birth. And here's some depictions, right? These people are climbing this ladder to heaven, but they may fall off and go down to hell or death. And same with the second one, right? They're crossing that bridge and they could end up in either place. This idea of scales, right? Just, I guess from Islam, and I guess that's an old Christian depiction of the scales, right? It's like, depending how the balance is, you could end up in the good place or the bad place. There's an Egyptian version. Oh, you know what? I forgot something that I wanted to say. In the first matrix, and how it's about heaven, if you watch that show, The Good Place, I thought it was really funny because one of the things in the last season, they're talking about heaven, and it's boring, but it's like it's heaven. And she said, yeah, like we never have to go to the bathroom because we all wear diapers. So that's like, yeah, that's like the first matrix. It just gets taken care of. You don't have to go. So I thought that was pretty accurate. Okay, so here we are, BPM 4. Physiologically, it means you were born and you made it. And the feelings would be sort of completion, triumph, success, and release, right? Like the relief of all the tension. Hopefully you get reconnected to your mother, and that's a very positive experience in the fourth matrix. But it's different than the first because you have that connection, but you're also a real person, right? You're a whole person. You're not just a part of somebody. So here's a Dolly depiction, right? It's like he's breaking out of that egg, like he's being born. And it's, right at that transition, it's still dangerous, it's scary, it's difficult, but you see the light at the end of the tunnel, or you see where you could get that is positive, and you see redemption. Same here, right? Here's some mandalas that people drew after breathworks, and right there's the light at the end of the tunnel. You have to get past those skulls, but then you're okay. So she is on the verge of escaping the spider, going to the light. And there's another one, it's scary, but she has the potential for freedom there and birth, really. Here's some more mandalas that people drew after the breathwork sessions, all pretty evocative of fourth matrix, birth. There's another one, right? So we're still pinned down, but you see the potential. Often, like not uncommon, I'd say, in breathwork, people have experiences of being born, right? We said the perinatal, like kind of reliving their birth, but also giving birth. Sometimes people say they gave birth to themselves. So someone drew that happening here. The biographical coex. So, feeling the fourth matrix in life, it's like completion, graduation, coronation, triumph. So we'll kind of tap into fourth matrix energy in these activities, experiences, the sense of escaping Earth's atmosphere, being free. What do we have here? Well, just some other cultural depictions of heavens, right? Different versions, angels and divine beings. There's a bunch of angels. I don't know if you can see that. It's just like this giant circle of angels. Pretty amazing. Buddhist version, I guess these are bodhisattvas merging into the white light, like dissolving in the light, going towards the light. Here's an alchemical version. It's like the sun and the moon together, I guess, kind of fourth matrix version of heaven. Here's an Egyptian depiction, right? Like, because that boat is going to take them to that other realm. Pika is pretty universal aspect of fourth matrix. Now, if you think about the transition from the third to the fourth, that's the moment of birth, right? So physiologically, in that moment, that's birth. Experientially, as we're saying, it's death, because you don't know what's happening. It's just going to feel like death. And spiritually, it's death and rebirth. So it's ego death, spiritual birth. And so, in all paths of transformation will tell you, like, you can't just change yourself. You actually have to die and be reborn. Like, if you want something to be different, let something die, let yourself die and be reborn, right? But what's dying is the ego, right? You don't have to physically die. Just let that part of your ego die, and then you will naturally go to a rebirth. Here's another depiction of that. So here's, you see on the lower left, the birth happening and going up into where the peacocks are. I like this one on the right. So here's a coffin, and out of death comes life. So the tree and the flower. So from death to life. The phoenix is a pretty standard symbol of death and rebirth. So that's it. Are we? All right, a little over an hour. So at this point, really love to open to comments and questions. If you guys want to share with each other your own experiences of any of this, and we can take a little bit of time for that, as long as you want, really.
I have something to say.
Go for it.
Hi everyone. I'm Julia. I'm Ted's niece. And when I was just listening to this, I was thinking about, I just gave birth recently to a baby, and I was thinking how to a dog, and when I was thinking when I was giving birth, how I went through all of the phases too as the mother. Like, it's very similar, because you're having contractions and it's really intense, and then such a release when the baby comes out and all of those processes. And then I was thinking how it's like, if the baby, when they're born, if it's somewhat traumatic because they don't have an ego presence, and I don't really know about this, like maybe it's more of a trauma for them because they aren't able to sort of witness the experience. But actually, I read this book on mindful birthing before I gave birth, and I was really trying to be a witness, like be able to experience my birth as this ceremony rather than like this traumatic experience, but this like powerful altered state experience. And so I was thinking, maybe when you give birth, you can heal the trauma of your birth by re-experiencing it in this other way, kind of like you do in breath work when you re-experience a trauma, but you sort of witness it instead of just being overwhelmed by it. So yeah, I was just reflecting on that and how that's kind of cool, and how they say that when you're giving birth that DMT flows through you. So like it was released in you. So it is actually altering, you are in this altered state of consciousness. So yeah, I don't know if you know more, have thought more about that or how that relates, but yep.
Well, I think it's interesting what you're saying. And I think the psyche is always longing for a reparative experience. And, Freud talked about the repetition compulsion, how we'll repeat our traumas. I don't think he saw it as a positive thing, but actually, right, it's the impulse is to do it over again and get it right this time and have it be different. And that's how we heal. Question, what is DMT? So dimethyltryptophan, I think. It's actually a powerful hallucinogen, and our brain produces it in small amounts. And I guess when you're giving birth, you get more of it. So you're sort of tripping.
I think it's that when you're giving birth, something makes it so that your body can process it, so that it affects you. Otherwise, you have something that inhibits it. But it, like, I think, maybe.
Right. Yeah,
Seems
DMT
like a lot of mystical experiences are like BPM4, is that right? But also I could see them as BPM1.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap, right? Because they're both very positive and heavenly in a way. And, I think a good way to, if you indulge me for 2 minutes here, to kind of see the differences. One of the most basic human myths is the hero's journey, right? And I think a really good example of that is The Hobbit. And it really follows this progression, right? Because he starts in his hobbit hole and he has all his provisions taken care of and it's comfortable. It's like a womb. All his needs are met in there. And then the dwarfs come and start pounding on the door. And then they come in and it's like gets really crowded, kind of like the womb before birth. And it's like he can't stay there anymore. He gets kind of launched out and he starts his journeys and struggles, and it's dangerous and scary, and he has to be aggressive, and it's like kill or be killed sometimes. And so that's obviously most of the story, is that third matrix part. And then he prevails and he comes back and he gets to be in his hobbit hole again. But the difference is, before he left, he wasn't really that respected, right? He's just a little hobbit. When he comes back, he has gravitas. He's like really respected. He's like a full member of society. So I think that maybe gives a little flavor of first versus fourth, right? There's the goodness, but in fourth matrix, you're really you. Is that answering what you're asking?
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful.
So I'm new to this, and I'm listening to your talk, and I just want to make sure I'm understanding it correctly. So this is the 4 stages of birth, and really at each stage, there's kind of reflections.
Oh, we lost. Is that me or them? Okay, that's them. So Emily's friends, if you come back, please come back and finish the question. I think for now we'll move on. Any other thoughts or questions?
I have maybe some thoughts and questions. So you were talking about the third matrix, and that during that time, that's when you've moved out of the place of depression and this is hopeless, and you're actually kind of in the biggest part of the struggle where the contractions are happening. You're in this place of kind of fighting against the depression, and you're in this aggressive space. And you talked about that in the idea of like being involved in high action sports or getting yourself into intense situations. Do you think that people choose relationships during those times that will give them that kind of intensity? And if so, if that's a pattern, what are we trying to get to? You notice I say we. What are we trying to get to? Why are we trying to get to that stage 4? Which again kind of ties into the question that the lady before asked, is what is the stage 4 really about? Back to that place of bliss, but what does that look like in real life? That just a sense of accomplishing something before you move on to the next thing, or is it the sense of self that you come into?
Well, there's a lot there. So I'll just try to share some thoughts about all of that. So in terms of, being attracted to those things, I think it's just because we inherently want to find a match between our internal and external states. So if we're already feeling that stuff, we're going to be drawn to it. I think a difficult, energetic, possibly even violent relationship can serve that for people, right? I'm not saying in a good way, but it can be attractive. If you think about those 4 matrices, the second and the third ones kind of suck. The first one and the fourth one is good. And if we're in the second one, our fantasy is going to be to go back to the first. If we're in the third, our fantasy is going to be to break out into the fourth, right? Yes. And you can even see, like when people are suicidal, when they're in the second, typically their thoughts will be like, oh, if I could just take this enough drugs and go to sleep. I just want to go back. They just want to move backwards. That's the solution to them. If you're in the third matrix and it's really difficult, sort of the fantasies, I can just blast out of here, and their fantasies of suicide will be tend to be more violent. Same with drugs, right? So I'm not saying all the time, but I think it's typical. Someone who's in second matrix will prefer the sense of like a barbiturate that'll just take me to that calm, peaceful place. Let me just go to sleep. And someone in third matrix enjoys something like meth or cocaine that's sort of like, So I think we're drawn to break through into fourth matrix, or we're drawn to go back into the piece of the first matrix, depending on where we are.
If we're in the third trying to get to the fourth, which is the natural progression of the way things have to happen, do you think that we must repeat those cycles like Freud said, where you're repeating it in order to fix it? I think Freud said that, but just that psychological way of thinking that you've got to repeat this in order to heal it or to fix it. Or can you just go, nope, I've done that a bunch of times and now I'm going to do something different to get to the fourth matrix?
Yeah, I think once we bring consciousness to what's happening and we witness it and we understand it, then we're not compelled, right? It's not our unconscious kind of pushing us into these things. But I still think we'll enjoy maybe you'll enjoy doing crossword puzzles and finishing it, or, you'll enjoy undertaking a big task and completing it. And so I think that nice feeling is something that we would continually recreate in our lives.
Or even that feeling of struggle, that we have to be involved in this challenging place of struggle. If we chose healthy things that would benefit our life rather than things that we're conscious of that are bad patterns in our life, then we would probably more readily move to that fourth place. Or do you think we have control with it at all?
Well, I don't know that we move there and stay there, but I think ultimately we can make conscious choices. And yeah, like there is no fourth without third, right? Like you need to go like study and struggle in college to graduate. You can't just go, I think I'm going to join college just for graduation, right? You have to like go through the struggle in order to have the fun part of the fourth matrix.
But choosing our struggle seems to be an important
when we can choose it. Yeah.
Nice.
Thought I saw Emily's friends rejoin, but then we lost them again.
Hello. Yeah, our internet went for a bit, but we seem to be back. I take it you didn't hear the question? Probably not.
That's right.
Okay, I'll ask it again. So I'm new to all this, and so it seems like what we're talking about here is really the full. Is it fair to say that we're kind of talking about the full range of human experience through birth?
I suppose, Stan sees that birth as kind of a fulcrum where that connects the biographical to the transpersonal, right? And so maybe it is kind of a microcosm of the whole thing. And as we sort of start to embrace the perinatal themes, it also opens up our experience to the transpersonal and spiritual themes. But it makes sense what you're saying that, well, I don't know. I mean, I guess there's things that can happen in life that don't really correlate to something in birth, but yeah, I don't know how to answer that. I guess we would all kind of feel how it is for us. It's an interesting question. What do you think? Do you think it's, does it feel like that? Yeah. Do you feel like it encompasses everything? These themes
I think
that
that's certainly, I think it's certainly possible. When we were talking about it through the slideshow, my instinct was that, right, first you have sort of it's like heaven, right? You don't have to like really struggle for anything and your needs are all met. And so that's kind of like you could call it like the positive sphere of experience, of like individual personal experience, like inner experience. And then when the womb kind of constricts, that's like hell in a way, right? Like that shapes the negative side. And then you have like okay, I'm in motion, I'm going somewhere, and then it's like you come out the other side, right? So I maybe kind of look for microcosmic parallels sometimes. So it just spoke to me in that way. So yeah.
Thanks.
When you were talking about, oh, sorry.
Let's go ahead.
When you were talking about Stan Grof's work with end-stage cancer patients, so was the goal of his work to get them to stage 4, or he would just follow them wherever they would go?
I really don't know. Yeah, I mean, he always follows you wherever you go, right? And if you train with him or you do the holotropic training with people who took that over, it's very much about trusting the inner healer and just following the process. And like the guy who directs the training, his first thing he wrote was like a treatise called Doing, Not Doing. So it's all about not directing, not bringing our own agenda in and just following. So that's always the case. With the cancer patients, I don't know at that point how much he developed this model. I don't know what he was thinking. Maybe some of that, but I think, I mean, I guess if they were experiencing ego death, then I guess they were going through that, right? And they were sort of having that ego death, spiritual birth, just like, I'm about to be born, but I really think I'm going to die, but then I'm born, so it was okay. But I think what you're saying makes sense, that in a way it's that fourth matrix, that third to fourth, that helps them lose their fear of death.
Thanks.
So I have a comment. This is the third time I've heard you give this talk, and it never occurred to me before. It just occurred to me that there's a parallel with my hike of the Appalachian Trail. And a lot of times I wonder why I did it. And I think it was to go through this experience where I left a comfortable place and went through pain and suffering. And the whole first half, I wanted to go home. But once I reached the halfway point, I wanted to get to 4 and reach the top of Mount Katahdin. And someone was filming me at the top and they said, "How do you feel?" And all I could think of was accomplished. But just like with birth, you have postpartum depression. I was depressed almost immediately after accomplishing that. So I don't think we ever get to 4 and stay there. I think we just need a new challenge. And that's kind of the purpose of life, is to just keep having experience. For me, is to keep having experiences, and most of it is painful,
Most of it is painful.
Yeah. Anyway, but it was I just like had that epiphany after, and this is very complicated stuff, and I like having it being reintroduced to it. I haven't read any of Grof's books, but this has been good for me. Yeah.
It's a really interesting example, right, of going through the matrices to undertake a journey like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I know we could talk a little bit about memory deconsolidation if you want.
I have a question that might be too specific to my experience that I can't articulate very well. I think it was the third matrix you were talking about, the sort of like I forgot what word you used, but this like cosmic tension of like that battle between like light and dark or good or evil or whatever, and a person feeling like they're at the center of that, like some sort of universal significance to their role in that. That's third matrix?
Yeah. Well, that specifically, I just sort of connecting that to one of the categories of spiritual emergency and saying that it's exactly that. Like people become identified with that giant battle.
Like why is like like I've experienced that a lot in my spiritual emergencies, and what always confuses me about it is like why I feel like I'm at the center of it. Like what's that piece of it about? Because from a logical perspective, I'm like, yeah, all that stuff happens, but like I'm a very small piece of this really big thing that's happening. But in those moments, it feels like I matter, like more than anything else, which I don't actually believe is the truth. So I like that might be too specific of a question, but I'm curious about like why is it that in those experiences you think that like you're the one to save the universe or whatever? I've never been able to rationalize that after those experiences.
It's interesting. I don't know. I mean, it feels like if I'm having a deep experience, I'm always going to be at the center of that experience, right? I'll always sort of identify with the protagonist, or yeah, I'll be at the center. Like if I'm going to have an identification with a whale, it's going to be me. I won't be like watching someone else think they're a whale. It's going to be me. I'm in that experience. I'm the one who's floating through the universe. So it would make sense. Like if you're tapped into that third matrix sort of big battle and light versus dark, it would make sense that it would feel like it's happening in me. Like I'm the center of this.
I think the tension is afterwards. It makes zero sense.
Well, that's hylotropic reality, right?
Yeah.
In holotropic reality, I mean, to keep those two separate, it's a good way to go through life, honoring both, but understanding what's what, and kind of knowing that if, like, I might have a spiritual experience of abundance, and wow, like there's this infinite abundance that I can benefit from, and but that doesn't mean I should just take all my money and spend it, you know. So, in a way, spiritual emergency is just kind of losing that boundary between hylotropic and holotropic, and it's starting to get confused. And then it's hard to be in the hylotropic world when you're feeling so much holotropic stuff. Then you don't behave properly like you're supposed to in the hylotropic. So it's like we have to keep them separate, right?
God, I wish you had been around a decade ago to tell all those psychiatrists that.
Yeah, it's a crime, really, how many people have been diagnosed and mislabeled as having a mental disorder when they're really just having a deep spiritual experience that they're having trouble managing at the time. It's really sad.
Yeah, that kind of gets into something I was just wondering about because I work in a hospital with people who are diagnosed as experiencing psychosis, and also having done a number of breathwork sessions and had very intense experiences. I notice a lot of similarities between my experiences in breathwork and when I'm talking to people who are experiencing psychosis. And I was just wondering if there's anybody who's kind of looked at I mean, that sort of idea of it as like a spiritual experience, or kind of some degree of what is like, sorry, just trying to connect those experiences, and then also kind of thinking about when we diagnose as a mental disorder. If that makes any sense. That's not a formal question, but
Yeah.
that makes any sense.
Well, I'd like to share a few thoughts about what you're saying. I mean, in some ways, it could be the same thing, and the difference is just knowing. Okay, this is holotropic and this is hylotropic. Stan made a cartoon once, and it's in the cartoon. There's like a yogi hanging upside down from a tree, and underneath the tree is a guy in a straitjacket, and the guy in the straitjacket says, "How come we're having the same experience, but they call you a mystic and they call me insane?" And then the yogi says, "Because I know who not to talk to." So in some ways, maybe the difference is just kind of knowing, like, I don't need to tell this person about this. I could tell my therapist, I could go to a breathwork workshop and share this, but I'm not going to just start telling people this is reality, because it just doesn't work in the hylotropic realm. And today I'm in hylotropic realm, I have to I'm talking to my boss. But I also think there's a difference sometimes, because my experience of people with psychotic disorders, it's often not the same. There's not like this transcendence in beauty. It's just disorganized and difficult, and like they're lost in there. And so I think sometimes there's just that difference too. Does that sound right to you, Ethan? Like, are the people that you're with, do they all seem like they're having these amazing spiritual experiences? They just don't know how to talk about it, or some of them just kind of lost in some.
No, I definitely say some of them are kind of lost. I mean, it varies, and it's very kind of individual experiences, and yeah, I'm just sort of trying to partially for my own self rectify. Because I mean, at this point with breath work, I tend to not actually really worry too much about doing like the formal breath, and it kind of just seems like if I go into a breathwork session, I can drop into a pretty heavily non-ordinary state of consciousness pretty quickly. And so just trying to rectify that as well with the work I do. And I can see that. I see your point there in terms of the different distinction.
Yeah. So, and I saw a question about hylotropic and holotropic. Well, let me answer that first, and then there's another point I want to make here. So, for who missed that, hylotropic just means moving towards matter. So it's our normal kind of consciousness, limited, focused. And holotropic is an expanded state of consciousness where we can access these transcendent and spiritual realms. But I also wanted to say a little bit about Ken Wilber's work in the pre-trance fallacy. And Ethan, you probably know this, but I think it's useful. So he talks about, how can I describe this without a picture? Sort of in our development, like as an infant, I don't know if you can see my hand. So like he'll draw this sort of shape, right? It goes up and then back down. And pre is like the state of an infant or a psychotic state. It's pre-egoic, right? There's no ego. There never was an ego. It's just kind of lost. And then our psychological development is sort of that moving up the slope to forming a strong and healthy ego. And then our spiritual development is letting that go. So I think if you're talking about a psychotic disorder, that's going to be someone who's pre-egoic. You're talking about a spiritual experience that's trans-egoic. There's this Buddhist therapist guy named Jack Engler. He said, you have to be a somebody before you can be a nobody. Right? So that's maybe another way to look at it. If once you can function in this world and then you sort of learn how to journey into these unbounded realms, that's different than if you can't even function in this world.
I just want to add too, for me as someone who experienced spiritual emergency as a result of complex trauma, I think I was misdiagnosed with schizophrenia for a long time. Part of what like made things so disorganized for me is being overly medicated on so many antipsychotic medications that weren't actually helping me. So I wonder if that confuses like being able to identify what's going on with people who are hospitalized, because every time I got hospitalized, they just pumped all kinds of drugs into me, and that certainly didn't help me clarify any of the experiences I was having either.
Yeah. It's so crude. I mean, sometimes, we'll talk in this year about sort of medical practices from 500 years ago and how crude they are. I mean, this is really crude, the kind of medications that get given, and they, sometimes they help in some ways, but they harm so much. But also, the whole theory of spiritual emergency is that these anomalous experiences are a healing, and it's a growth. And so we want to encourage the resolution of that. We want to allow people to move through that and come out the other side, right? Like come out the fourth matrix. And the Western model is we got to shut it down. Like, this is dangerous. It's not appropriate. And hey, here's a medication that'll stop what's happening, and that's a good thing. It's a horrible thing because often it gets people stuck there. Right? So Winston Churchill, is noted for saying, if you're going through hell, keep going. And, our Western approach to medicine often like, well, hey, someone's going through hell, well, let's stop them. That feels good. It's like, okay, well, now you just stop them in the middle of hell, and now they're stuck there.
Well, I mean, not to get us too much into this, but yeah, that is has been one of my concerns working in a hospital system. Is it seems like we do take people and pump them full of antipsychotics and hold them legally against their will. And it is sort of that thing of, I have been wondering, are we kind of just inadvertently potentially shutting them kind of into an experience that could be potentially healing if we kind of encourage them to just go through whatever it was, instead of trying to kind of bring them back to some sort of shared reality. I mean, and partially this is coming from my own breathwork experiences of having gone through some very intensive experiences, but then also kind of ultimately in processing and going like, oh, I needed to go through that to kind of do something. I'm not always fully certain what, but as part of the healing process.
Yeah, it'd be like if Jackie is, 2/3 of the way through her hike on the Appalachian Trail, and she goes, "Wow, this really hurts," and it goes, "Okay, I can fix this. I'm going to put a big barrier up, and you can't hike anymore. Problem solved." And unfortunately, a sad thing is, part of it is economic, right? Like the amount of hours needed to support somebody through a spiritual emergency can be huge, and it's sort of just cheaper to give them the drug. It's going to go, okay, problem solved.
I wonder if people that are severely psychotic and, like what you were saying, they're really not functioning in life even before this emergence happens with them, and then they start going through everything. But it's been like a lifelong problem, or it's been a steady thing that's getting worse and worse as they get older and older. Would you say that the trauma was just so intense that they have not been able to even get to the point of having a healthy ego, being able to function well in life? Would the same practices work on them if we were able to bring it maybe to a different level of understanding for them with the same modalities and things that we use, help them to come out of that space? Or do they not, are they not at a level where they can understand that kind of work, or where that work would be effective?
Yeah, I don't know, and I don't think anyone knows, right? Like, no one even knows what schizophrenia is, and is it, to what degree it's a result of trauma, to what degree it's genetic, it's just, nobody can agree on this stuff. So it's kind of just guessing. I mean, I do believe that there's people that doing these practices is just never going to work for, because they don't have the tools to use it.
Right.
And there's people who, certain medications make a huge difference and benefit them, right? I mean, there's where I used to live, my neighbor was schizophrenic, and he had a pretty good life. Like he was pretty heavily medicated, but he could function. He enjoyed a lot. It's like his medication really saved him. So it's just so complicated. I don't know that anyone really has the answers to this.
Hey, Ted, what is... Sorry, go ahead.
Lots of questions right now. I'll step back.
I'd like to speak on what Patty was just asking and or saying. I'm Kimberly. Hi. This is just from my experience, and I work with animals in healing various kinds of people. I mean, and we'll go for hours giving them the opportunity. Like I've watched nonverbal children pitch a fit, like you might do if you're in breath work or intention, literally for like 3 hours. And we're not doing any kind of breath work processes. They're just responding to the environment, to the animals, and what the animals evoke. So, I mean, from my witness, I have seen children and people come off of 7 and 8 medications within a year period of time. And just be, and they start to connect the dots, and then they level out. But I do believe that, like Ted said, it's easier to do 50-minute therapy sessions and write somebody a prescription than to come to a farm for 8 hours once a week and really dive in and work on it.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yes. But I also believe that, I mean, I'm a healer, and I highly believe, and I've seen such transformation, that our bodies do have the innate wisdom and power to heal themselves, whatever it is.
And the psyche, and that's really what the whole holotropic model is based on, right? This the inner healer, that rather than direct that healing, we just let that, once we get into that non-ordinary state, that it takes over and it will bring us the experience we need.
Hey, Ted, what does Stan Grof say about psychosis? I remember reading his book, Spiritual Emergency, where he talks, I feel like I remember that he did spend some time differentiating spiritual emergency experiences from clinical psychosis. So do you know what he would say about the distinction?
Yeah, if I can remember. He used to teach this a long time ago. So, I mean, there are some things to look at, right? And I think one is, can the person have some kind of a attitude towards what's happening that's curious, and some awareness? And I'm kind of blanking on sort of the criteria, but definitely there's sort of almost like a little checklist. One is, if I'm having an experience and I don't even know what it is, and I'm just telling you, then that's more likely to be a spiritual emergency. If I'm claiming to be Jesus's brother, right? So I'm bringing some concept from my culture and enacting it. That's more likely to happen in a psychotic experience, for example. So these kinds of things. I mean, it's interesting because there's a whole other movement that, because I was working on this in the Grof Foundation about spiritual emergency, and we sort of got with this other group, and they're advocating, they don't like that distinction because then they feel it makes the people who are psychotic second-class citizens, and they think all you should do is push for humanely treating everybody and they don't like even making that distinction. But I think it's an important distinction because it helps guide your treatment. And where if someone's having a spiritual emergency, you don't want to medicate them. You don't want to get them stuck in that, and you want to support them and help them get to the other side. So Stan and Christina edited a book for people who are interested in this topic called Spiritual Emergency, and they collected a bunch of articles and essays about that. And you can also just go online and type in Spiritual Emergency and read all about it too. It's a pretty interesting field. We had enough.
I had a question. When you first showed the slides of like BPM 1, 2, and 3, there were these like terms attached to each one, like a planet for each one. What was that about?
Yeah, that's not my thing, but you can associate the energies of these planets with these states, right? And so I'm going to get back there really quick. Let me just say what they are. Okay. Yeah, so Neptunian is the first matrix, Saturnian is the second, right? So people who are into these kind of energies, like the Saturnian energy is very depressed and it's dark and it's confined and constrained. BPM3, the Plutonian, I guess is expansive and aggressive, and Uranian is, expansive. And so I don't know much about that. I just thought it was interesting that people made that association. If anyone knows about those and can speak to that, I'd be interested to hear.
What was the memory consolidation or the other piece that you were mentioning?
All right, I'll give you a real fast version of that, and then if you want to learn more, look up Bruce Ecker, Ecker, and he has a thing called coherence therapy, and you can watch some videos on his site. But it's really interesting, and I think I can say it very simply, which is so how memory is stored. And simply, first, there's the memory of what happened, which is stored in the cortical regions of the brain. And then there's the feeling of what happened, which is stored in the amygdala. So the memory is not all in one place. Type that man's name. Well, I'll say it's Ecker, Bruce Ecker, or you can look for coherence therapy and find him too. So the effect of trauma isn't really about the declarative memory, right? It's not about the story of what happened. That doesn't really hurt us. It's the emotional memory that's the problem. So if we have PTSD, the problem is that these emotional memories sort of pervade our experience, and it's very hard to tell them apart from what's happening now versus kind of the memory of what was happening and how it feels. So then the other thing about memory that he says is that it's not like set in stone. It's not like a static storage, that it's more dynamic. And when you have a memory and then it goes into storage, like long-term storage, when you think about it or you experience it, especially for an emotional memory, when you're feeling it, it comes out of long-term storage and it's in working memory. And then when you're done with sort of the experience, the tendency is it'll just go back into long-term storage. So that's called reconsolidation, right? So the memory doesn't just stay there. It comes out and it goes back in again. And he's saying if you can disrupt the reconsolidation, that would be deconsolidation. And there's interesting experiments where you can give a mouse What's the drug? I think it's a heart drug. Well, anyway, you give a mouse a drug, particular drug, and it inhibits the formation of these long-term memories. It inhibits the reconsolidation. So you condition the mouse to be afraid of a part of the maze, and then the mouse will always avoid that part of the maze. And then you give the mouse the drug, and you put them in that maze, and they don't get shocked, say, and they lose their fear. So it's like when the memory can't get restored, they lose that emotional memory and they don't have that reaction anymore. So his therapy is about the way you deconsolidate the memory is you pair it with what he calls a prediction error. Like it's like a mismatch or an opposite. So at the same time that you're feeling the trauma and you're feeling I'm in danger or I'm powerless or, you know, I'm not in a safe place, you evoke an awareness of the opposite. Like I am safe and I am bigger actually, and I have power. And the fact that that one is so opposed to the first one blocks the reconsolidation of the memory, and it actually kind of erases. So that's like a quick version, but you could read more about it. And he doesn't talk about, last I checked, he doesn't know about breath work, but I think breathwork is such a powerful way, or really any non-ordinary state work, because it so powerfully brings up the feeling, like it activates the amygdala where you're fully feeling that trauma. But on some level, it's like, wow, I'm just lying here on a mat and it's comfortable and I'm safe and someone's just watching over me and the music's kind of cool and all these people are cool and then we're going to have some food. And it's like the contrast sort of becomes the deconsolidation of that memory. So anyway, there's the 2-minute version.
Is that what EMDR does?
I think when you're doing like the positive beliefs, I think it is. Yeah, you're sort of pairing the right, and they'll ask you when you remember that thing and then you think the positive thought, what happens, right? Like how true does it feel? And yeah, so they're introducing that juxtaposition between the traumatic memory and then the opposite of the negative thought that that memory is associated with.
I got a question.
Sir.
Hello.
Hi.
Like, what are some socially viable ways of, like, working in the world? Like, say, it seems like stage 3 is sort of like the drama of life and sort of is a cyclical, like Sisyphusian kind of hamster wheelie kind of this whole system. And I'm wondering if I'm wondering if there's ways to work and engage in that in the world, sort of in a balance, or what are some socially viable ways, if so, to work in a balance between stage 3 and stage 4? Does that make sense?
I think so. I mean, you could be an activist, right? Like you could say, like, I'm dedicating my life to kind of overthrowing the oppressive system of government. You could be a firefighter, right? So there's a lot of activities that are dangerous, but maybe not too dangerous, but that could evoke that sense of, big energies.
Cool.
I saw a client today he's playing the market and he really gets off on it, but he's not being addicted, right? Like he kind of puts it down and then he knows. But when he's treating these like it's I could win, I could lose, oh my God, and it's sort of like there's a pleasure in that, right? And some people get addicted to it, but if you can kind of enjoy it without getting lost or stuck in it, then that could be cool.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. So I think we should be winding down. Any last questions, or anyone want to just shout something out or say goodbye or anything like that?
I
Thank
guess
you
I
very
would
much
ask,
for this, Ted.
yes,
Welcome.
thank you.
Yeah, it was fun being with you guys.
I have a question about what you were talking about with deconsolidating memories. So if you're in the space of the trauma coming up and the fullness of the psychological, emotional, even body memory that's triggering you, and you're able to, would it be like an affirmation? Would it be like an affirmation or even an action where you move into something positive that kind of flips the lid on that thing? And brings you into a place of like, okay, I'm powerful now over this. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I think affirmations can be powerful in that way, but it's also just recognizing the truth that, it's not just like, oh, I'm powerful, but like, I have choice and I can leave the situation if I choose to. And sort of just recognizing what's true that's in contradiction to the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's just sort of the pairing of them that becomes effective.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, let's, a lot of people with cameras off, but whoever's still here, say goodbye. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for listening. Come and do breathwork if you want. I'll probably add you guys if I get around to it to our email list. So you'll get an email and you can always, it's easy to cancel those if you want, but you'll get offers if you want to try the breathwork and stuff.
Let's say thank you, Ted.
Yeah, thanks for your comments.
Thank you,
questions.
Ted.
Thank you, Ted.
Thanks, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, MD.
Bye. See you at breathwork.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Actually, I don't think we will see.
All right. I'm going to end this meeting. Good night to one and all.